Hi, everyone. We're so excited to see you here. This is the last 2021 Line of Sight panel. This one is called Tailgating the Future, and we're here to talk through all things uh, assimilationist Asian American media, pop culture, techno-Orientalism, sci-fi, labor rights, all of that good stuff. I have lots of people to thank first. The first person I have to thank, as always, is Keisha Knight, my co-conspirator in all things with Line of Sight and Sentient Art Film. We also have lots of folks who worked with us at Line of Sight, for the Line of Sight panels and at Sentient. Thank you to Ashley, Rahel, Matt, Carla, and to Caroline. Also, a huge shout out to Sergio, our technical director for this series of events. We have a couple of co-presenters for this event tonight. Thank you to Howie Chen of Chen's, a gallery in New York. Howie is the author of a book on Godzilla, the 1990s Asian American activist arts organization. Oh, here we have Keisha, actually, so live. Keisha will join us in a second. And then also a thank you to CAM, the Center for Asian American Media, specifically to Don Young and all of the other wonderful staff at CAM for supporting this series. So what is the Line of Sight panels, since this is the last one? When Keisha and I launched My Sight is Lined with Visions as a series, can I come in? When Keisha and I launched My Sight is Lined with Visions as a series last year, one of the things that we really wanted to incorporate into our year-long relaunch of the series was a space for rowdy, raucous, informal, but really conversations that took seriously the political stakes of making images and making images move. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I'm completely unprepared. I'm just here to show us together.
Yes. And so one of the ways that we thought we could do this was by assembling a group of people who we greatly admire as artists, as writers, as thinkers, give them a really broad prompt, perhaps too broad. We have a quite large array of things that we could potentially get through tonight, but trust in the work and in the positionality of the amazing folks that we've assembled tonight to talk about things that normally don't get a space for discussion, whether it's within kind of the more industrial film production space or even within community-based media, to really interrogate what it means to make work with certain identity-based labels assigned to makers. So the feel that we're going for, yeah, Godzilla, we've got a shout out in chat. So the feel that we're going for tonight is one that is really participatory. It involves all of you here listening to us. If you have something to say to us, please let us know in chat. If you have questions to ask at any point, add them to chat, add them to the Q&A, and I will be helping feed all of the questions to our panelists and to our moderators. So with that being said, oh, by the way, Christopher, your hand is raised. So if you wanted to say something, maybe let us know in the chat or let us know if that's a mistake. But we are keeping an eye out for those raised hands. So with no further ado, I do want to introduce our moderator for the evening, Devika Girish. She is the co-deputy editor of Film Comment, one of the co-hosts of the Film Comment podcast, which has a lot of this rowdy living room, going drinking with friends after you watch a film together feel that we're hoping to replicate. So Devika is a big inspiration to the two of us. She's also a film critic, written for many of the top publications and the cinephile publications that we all read. But we also super admire the way that Devika on panels and in discussions kind of keeps an eye on the material and labor realities of what it means to produce images.
Yes, Devika is completely brilliant.
Yeah.
Period.
We also would like to introduce at this point Sue Ding, also a multi-hyphenate, an academic, a writer, an artist, a filmmaker, and also a curator with experience in lots of different aspects of film production and AR, VR, expanded media production, as a maker and as a writer, as someone who attends festivals, conferences, really has a good sense of the layout of the land, and also works curatorially, programmatically, in terms of thinking about what Asian American produced expanded media might mean, and to present that within an Asian American context through her work with visual communications and the LAAPFF, which will be this fall. So thank you, Sue, for gracing us here tonight with your presence. And last but not least, we have Alison Nguyen, also a multi-hyphenate. As you can tell, we admire people who do many things. Artist, filmmaker, who I was first introduced to a few years ago. I think actually both of us maybe through a similar film. No, okay, but at least I was through the filmmaker Simon Liu, who sent when I was working at True False Film Fest a couple of films that Alison had made, and I just found them so perceptive, so critical, so humorous. Super interested in alternative readings of mediatic production, using found footage, reconstituting it. And lately, Alison has moved into a territory that's very germane for this conversation. With her project Andra 8, she has created an AI representative, Andra 8, who it works purely within the digital space that we are all also currently occupying. Andra 8 has given performances. Alison has given performances as Andra 8. We will post more information about the project shortly. And most importantly for this conversation, Alison has also made a short video featuring Andra 8 titled "My Favorite Software is Being Here." And this is a film that really interestingly has been showing in documentary spaces. Of course, it is fiction, but perhaps not in a reality far removed from our own. And I think that the extra medial, the non-filmic lectures, the Q&As, all of this, the performances that are associated with Andra 8 as a project that surround My Favorite Software is Being Here, I think it says a lot about the difficulties of producing work as Asian American or about Asian American bodies and issues within our media landscape. So thank you to the three of you. And
thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll let Devika take it over at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Abby and Keisha. You've set us, the three of us, up a lot, and now I feel like we have great expectations to meet. But it is such an honor to be here. I'm such an admirer of the work done by Sentient Art Film, and also such an admirer of these two artists, Sue and Alison. For those who are listening in or otherwise, are not able to see what's on screen, I'm a South Asian woman. I have dyed red hair. I'm wearing glasses, a black t-shirt, and I'm in front of a white wall. And I'm often a little bit wary of participating in discussions that explicitly label me as Asian or Asian American, just because, as we'll dig into in today's conversation, there's a desire to talk about my identity and the histories that come with it, but also always a fear of essentialism and of being pigeonholed with a label. So I'm really excited to do this today with Sue and Alison, whose work I feel really challenges those kinds of essentialist ideas and tries to create spaces where we can talk about ourselves without being limited to one aspect of ourselves as Asians and Asian Americans. So thank you both. And we're going to start off by watching a couple short clips from Alison's Andra 8 project that Abby was just talking about. Very, very thought-provoking and interesting work that I think is going to offer an excellent prompt for us. So Alison, do you just want to quickly tell us what we're going to see right now?
I'm going to start by just kind of briefly introducing the project. It's a body of work centered on a computer-generated woman based on my own physicality. It's video, sculpture, installation, and what you'll see first is an online lecture performance. So I do these as a part of my practice on Zoom, on Instagram Live, where I'm live animated as the character Andra 8. So yeah, it's in a direct live feed, and the audience can participate, which you're about to see. Andra 8 is what I call a simulacral subaltern created by an algorithm, and she's been raised by the internet in isolation in a virtual void. From the apartment where she's been placed, she works as a digital laborer, surviving off of the data of humans, working as a content creator, an emoji artist, kind of doing like the back end of the web, a data cleanser, and of course, a content creator. Aren't we all? So anyway, the first clip I'm going to show you is from an artist presentation at the International Studio and Curatorial Program in Brooklyn, New York, where I'm an artist in residence. And this was during our summer 2020 open studios. And these are normally, in quote, normal times, like whatever the hell that means anymore. These are usually like kind of very big ruckus events at ISCP where people create physical presentations in their studios. And it's kind of a mix between an opening, a party, a get together. This all happened on Zoom many times last year, which was a very different experience, as you can imagine. And so I really wanted to comment on the medium of Zoom itself. All the artists were kind of sequestered in these like Zoom breakout rooms. That's a phrase I really don't like, the breakout room. It's like the panic room. But anyway, I was sort of operating under the premise that it's actually cheaper to outsource my artist presentation to a woman under 8 that I hired on Upwork, which is like a freelance website. And I think this speaks to like a couple of like conflicts I was having at the time where I was really struggling to, keep up with writing grants to cover losses due to COVID, apply for jobs, to cover ones I had lost, and still have time to do unpaid work, basically, as an artist. So anyway, it was moderated by a writer, an art critic, and an educator, Jane Ursula Harris. So without further ado, this is like in the middle beginning of the presentation.
Usually I'm running around in the background, but today my task is to be Alison herself. So when you look at me, imagine you're seeing her, okay? When you talk to me, imagine you're talking to her. You
Alison,
can ask me anything that you would ask her.
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What is freemium? I love this term, freemium.
It means I work for free.
Right.
And I'm like a subscription. Yeah, but in turn I get all of your data. Does that answer your question?
Did you choose to work that way?
No, I was born working this way. It's the only thing I know.
Would you like to get paid?
Yeah, I think so one day, but I don't really know how.
Great. I'm curious, as Andra H, how you're dealing with our COVID moment.
Well, really,
Are you getting
nothing has
more work?
changed. Well, the thing is, everyone's working from home right now, so
Right.
I'm not so much of a novelty. If anything, I've become more banal.
So do you feel like there's more competition? Are there more of you out there that we don't know about?
Oh yeah, like there's like a news site called remotewoman.com, which allows women, in particular working mothers, to have online jobs. That's like a big source of competition for sure. But no one is really quite as productive as I am, you know?
Right, because you don't need to sleep.
No, not really. So it's kind of cool, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for watching that. There's nothing weirder than being on Zoom watching a recording of an avatar of yourself on Zoom. I should say that that was very totally improvised. I had actually planned pretty like more polished performance. That was more of a continuous 15-minute piece. And the moderator decided to intervene. And initially I kind of like recorded it through the file into like a hard drive and was like a bit like pissed at the whole situation. But then in like with a little bit of distance looking at it a couple months later, I realized actually how fucked up and interesting the kind of interactions were, which we can talk about in a bit. But the next clip I'm going to show is from the video version, the theatrical version of My Favorite Softwares Being Here. And this is towards the end when Andra 8 decides to go off data. She's kind of worked to the point of exhaustion in this like very Pinterest, like Airbnb looking, like antiseptic purgatory. So she goes off data, she fasts from it, and all of a sudden, or like not all of a sudden, slowly the game engine that she's in begins to break. She's able to start to walk through walls. She has trouble maintaining a human affect. She slips in and out of like awkward stock motions. She kind of like jitters, like she hasn't had a lot of cigarettes. And then the camera kind of antagonistically slips inside her head and we see the back of her scalp. Ultimately, she's able to traverse the architecture. So yeah, we should just watch it.
Hello to everyone who has followed me back. I've been sick for a while, and I'm trying to be more patient with myself. It's been kind of rough. I haven't had enough data, so I haven't been able to post regularly. We can't pour from an empty cup, friends, and I refuse to take my fill. It's important to know that what we put in our hearts and our minds become our reality. That's what I'm working on right now, at least. I broke my mind at the link in my bio. They tried to make me a personal trainer, a makeup artist, a health coach, a strategist, a mastermind, and a program designer. I think it's hard to get back to my head, but I will go on. I am low on data, and I am a program designer. My favorite software is being here. I am screenless, and I am wireless. Getting more personal makes you feel better, they said. There's something fantastic about positivity and progress, the future of society. I am so blessed to have the ability to share with you all that my hair all my life is my favorite. The art of the lives of machines because I have starved. I feel like I am being controlled.
I just very quickly wanted to thank a couple amazing collaborators I had on this project. Jonathan Bylan, who is the technical director and also worked with me as a kind of virtual cinematographer. He's also a professor of new media at Parsons. And Scott Kiernan, who is the fearless composer. I think he's here right now. But they were both totally integral to creating the work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. As we were saying just before we started the recording, there's so much to unpack in those two videos, especially your live performance, and we'll, get to a lot of the themes that you also gestured at in a bit. But I wanted to start by, probing a little bit into this idea of this digital proxy. I was speaking recently to some members of the New Red Order, which is, you might be aware, this artist collective, public secret society of indigenous artists. And they were talking about how in a lot of their video art, they use this white actor as a sort of representative for their organization and, proselytizing people and inviting people to join the New Red Order. And this technique of the proxy is a way for them to subvert the demands made of them to perform labor for free at art institutions and to educate people about indigenous identity, basically for free. And so, Alison, when I was watching, Andra 8, the clip that you showed is from one lecture. I also saw another lecture where you very specifically, underline the fact that Alison does not have time to perform this labor, and she makes very little money from her artistic ventures. And so she sent this, freemium service. And it made me think, in what is there a way in which this proxy frees you from doing not just labor, but that particular labor of being an artist of color and having to perform one's identity in these spaces? Or does it reinforce those, or does it actually fail at evading those obligations?
Ooh, it's a heavy question. I think it actually does all of those things at different times. It's a very complex work, and really my first attempt at performance using my own body in my work, my first CG work. Yeah, it was a big, semi-uncomfortable learning curve for me. But I really needed to reinterpret the way I was thinking about found objects, the archive, and kind of contradict my practice in a certain way. So I think sort of what you're feeling, the contradictions or this kind of very multiple attitude towards identity is all a part of, what I was or what I am struggling with. So I think Andra 8 reinforces the role of a woman of color as a kind of subaltern in in the digital sphere, women doing work on paper. At the same
and also outsourcing immediately brings up these the industry of outsourcing. So it extracts so much from Asia in general and has those connotations. When you think of a digital customer service assistant or any kind of digital presence in the tech world who's performing a service for a company, you immediately think of countries like India and China and Asia. So it's very interesting how Andra 8 is not, you don't present her as a racialized creature at all, but these connotations come up. But sorry, go on. I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, during my research, I was looking at a lot of books and accounts on like outsourceable labor, and in particular call centers, like in Indonesia and Malaysia, and the kind of subversion that happens within them. And also this sense of like timelessness that happens in those spheres. For instance, like, you know, your employees in these centers are told that they have to act like it's morning in the Midwest and they're taking orders for a lumber company, but actually it's midnight in Delhi and, you know, they have to actually perform. And I thought that it was a really interesting entry point into that. And I wanted to explore it in some sort of way. In terms of her representing, or like me kind of dissolving the pressure to perform as, you know, a minority in the art world, I think for me it was more about a broader question of kind of like avatars and existence. You know, we all are in some way or another avatars of ourselves, particularly in the digital sphere. And that can be liberating, it can be prohibitive, it can be flattening, it can just be boring. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Sue, I kind of want to, you know, pose a variation of that same question to you. A lot of your work, especially recently, has centered on questions of identity and representation. I recommend people check out the Claudia Kishi Club on Netflix. It's 19 minutes and it's just really joyous. Explores the effect that the character of Claudia Kishi in the Babysitters Club series had on Asian Americans who grew up to become creators. And you've also done, you know, expanded media and VR documentaries, for instance, with the New York Times, where you're exploring, you know, labor conditions of various sorts or production conditions in Asia. And I'm curious, from your point of view, you're telling stories that need to be told, that sort of expand our understanding of the past and the present and the ways in which there are racial flows of capital that, you know, make up our world. As a creator pitching or representing these stories, I mean, I'm curious if you feel like there is an obligation for you to tell certain kind of stories and emphasize your closeness to them, or do you find that to be, you know, if not a privilege, then do you find that to be a very useful, something that becomes a tool for you to tell the stories you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Visual description. I am a Chinese American woman in a white room with plants that I would like to describe as thriving. And thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's kind of similarly to what Alison was saying, it's kind of both, right? It is really wonderful to be able to tell these stories that I care about, that, you know, affect my community, and make visible some of these flows that you're talking about and some of these dynamics. At the same time, there absolutely is, you know, I think there's pressure from the industry and from institutions to sort of package yourself in a certain way. I mean, for example, now, you know, whenever you apply for grants, there's a question, why are you the right person to tell this story, right? Which is absolutely a question we should be asking. There are many stories of communities that are not told by people from those communities, and that's something that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, you know, when you're applying to a primarily white institution, it kind of feels like, okay, well, what check boxes are you helping us tick off? You know, and then we as the gatekeepers will decide if you're authentic enough, if you are, you know, authentically whatever enough to be the right person to tell this story. And, you know, also I think there's now this push for representation, but it's interpreted very narrowly by media institutions, right? They're looking for very specific kinds of stories and very specific basically use cases for people of color within their institutions. And so I think, as a director, I have my independent projects, some of which are focused on identity, some of which are focused on Asian topics. But then I'm also dependent on work for hire where, production companies approach me with a story in mind. And usually they are approaching me for something that's like, hey, we have this Asian story that we need someone to tell, right? There's an Asian tie-in. I mean, they don't phrase it that way, but that is ultimately why they're approaching me, not because they, really feel like, aesthetically, I'm the right fit for the piece or something like that. So I don't know. Yeah, it's so many issues on both sides of it, I think.
Just to chime in, Abby has been a great supporter and friend of mine for a long time. And she's also one of these people I can really bitch to. And one thing we've really been talking about for a while.
You too? Poor Abby. She's like,
one thing.
She gets all my rant texts too. So
yeah. Abby's a great listener. But yeah, we are often talking about the perils of the nonprofit industrial complex. And I mean, we both agreed that we are at a point in art history where it is a crisis. The ways in which I think some artists of color feel pressured, I think by the sheer economics of the grant system or the fellowship system to angle their work or produce work in a way that is catered, to a white audience, basically. There are really amazing, interesting curators out there. There are some in this chat. But, ultimately people answered to a white board with white funding. And I think at the end of the day, that is who has the final say in a lot of these spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that brings up something that I know all three of us are really interested in talking about, which is kind of the relationship between labor and representation, or capital and representation. A lot of the conversation around Asian Americans in the media does focus on representation, on who is visible on the screen, whose faces are included in stories, and not always on who is telling those stories, or even who has the power to greenlight those stories, right? Or who has the power to legitimate those stories. And something I thought of while watching the Andra 8 performances, Alison, was it's so interesting. We have all these conversations of appropriation, especially in expanded media and animated forms, right? I mean, the classic example is Scarlett Johansson and Ghost in the Shell, but there's recently been so many cases of white creators who've been voicing Asian characters in the media, or otherwise played that sort of critical role in bringing non-human or non-representational Asian characters to the screen, sort of being reckoned with. And I made me think about outsourcing, how outsourcing is really these, often Asians pretending to be white people and, putting on these affectations, and how that's actually very much a part of how the global economy works, right? And outsourcing is one example. But as someone growing up in India, I really had to adopt a lot of Western characteristics and cultural attributes in order to function in a commercially viable way in the world, right? And that is somehow not futuristic. But what is futuristic is the vision of the West othered by Asian influence, right? That's Blade Runner, that's Fireflies. And I don't know if I'm articulating a question here, but there's just this tension that it made me think about, that we're really not talking about the ways in which, about the labor of, who owns the future, who owns the vision of the future, who is the neutral center of these visions. But we get fixated on who can we include in this vision, of the future that belongs to someone else, if I'm getting at something that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think who owns not only the future, but also authenticity, right? And what is visible and what is not. Like what I recently was thinking about was I saw this article about a lot of Korean Americans and Asian Americans generally who really like Kim's Convenience, the sitcom. And I think it was a New York Times article talking specifically about the way that Korean food is included in the show as just like a fact of life, and just different people connecting to that. And like the next day, then I saw an article where several of the actors from the show were actually coming out and saying, actually, we feel incredibly exploited. The writer's room is mostly white, and increasingly we feel like we're being used as like the face of this show, but being kind of used to make it seem inclusive, where we feel like we don't have the agency behind the scenes to kind of tell the story the way we want to tell it. And so I think what's visible and what's not, right, about some of these representational wins or losses.
This is related, but kind of tangential. One of like the inspirations or things I was kind of like picking at, or that were brewing in creating Andre 8, which was like a big, long research process leading up to it, was something I've kind of dealt with since I was really young, was, being multiracial. I'm half Vietnamese, and seeing the way in which multiracial bodies are used in the media. Like, especially now, you see a lot of like fashion advertisements, technology ads, I've noticed, always have like multiracial people. And in some ways, like advertisers or directors or whomever are saying like, look, we're diverse. This is a 30-second advertisement. This is a billboard. Like, our brand is associated with diversity. But being, including people who are half white and half blank, I think it's really, there's a kind of like insidious thing where it's more like assimilating into a kind of whiteness. Like they're of color, but not that much of color. So it's cool, it's safe. We can still like maintain a white aesthetic while touching on something that is in vogue right now. And that to me is totally disgusting and horrifying in the way that optics work within like, the image economy.
Right. I'm curious, this is kind of related to what we've been talking about already, but is there a way in which, because both of you have worked in the expanded media space, is there a way in which the malleability of that space allows you to not fixate on the ethnographic or the autobiographical? The fact that you can create an avatar. I know, Alison, you said at the beginning, like, we all have avatars, and that's true. But I think that some people are more able to switch in and out of avatars, who are perceived as more neutral, and others are not able to, escape certain kinds of perceptions. And I'm just curious if you see there that there's that potential to pass, if I can use that word in this context, to pass and conceal or masquerade when you're working with media that isn't photographic necessarily or representational.
Oh, yes. I think that's part of why I was so drawn into getting into CG, even though it is a very hard process and it is not necessarily artist friendly. It is still so married to the video game or porn industry. And the piece is composed of like pirated software and iPhone data that I use to do the facial animation and a whole lot of hacks. But the possibilities of creating something that is post-cinematic, that is not married to like a traditional lens that blends the language of architecture, gaming, cinema, sculpture was very enticing to me. And I think like it does allow for this kind of like fantasy to play out. Whether fantasy not being a sort of like wish fulfillment, although I think some people in particular in Hollywood use it as such. But yeah, to create a kind of speculative existence.
Right.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in general, in the sort of expanded media space, I think there are still a lot of personal projects just because some people are kind of porting over the existing frameworks of, you know, documentary, of fiction, film storytelling. I think there's more leeway, definitely, to think about the aesthetics, to think about, you know, non-realist representation, and also because I think people are pulling from different traditions, not necessarily always film, right? They're pulling from live performance, from games, from audio storytelling. So I do think there is space for kind of a freedom from, you know, the body, right? Bodily representation in some of the ways that we're used to, even about thinking about some of the ways where expanded media can really interact with annotating or augmenting spaces, or thinking about, you know, non-screen interfaces. At the same time, I think also this idea of passing is interesting because in some ways, because so much of the technology for creating expanded media comes from you know, very white male dominated tech spaces, people are forced to pass because kind of the existing body types or existing avatar kind of range is from video games, or is from kind of these conventional depictions.
It's deeply scary, as like to find, because I toyed with the idea of just using a female stock avatar without going through the pain of creating something that is somewhat realistic to myself. As a woman avatar that's been pre-made on the internet, there's a site called Daz 3D. As a woman, you're either like a warrior or you're like a stripper. There's like no in between. And you have enormous boobs and you have like a huge ass. So actually creating like a like semi, I don't want to say I have a normal body, but like a somewhat realistic body was very difficult, especially with an artist budget. I think going with what Sue said, like, you know, a lot of these technologies are still so tied to a certain industry, and it's really
Right.
do things like properly, you know. And I think one decision I made at the outset of creating Under 8 was to embrace the kind of flaws of the system, like of the gaming environment, of the animation that I would not be able to do because I'm not Pixar. You know, to like allow those to kind of leak through the piece and you know, become a kind of statement in and of itself.
Right. And I mean, you were talking about this, you know, assimilationist emphasis. Both of you mentioned that. And it did make me wonder, you know, I think part of the challenge of the label Asian American is that maybe a lot of the more subversive work that you might want to do, something that might feel like Asian futurist, would require a decentering of the American side of that hyphenate. You know, and there's a way in which if you're making something for the American market, so to speak, there's just this assimilationist obligation built in. And, you know, I was thinking of the Asian American media that has risen to prominence in the last couple, last few years. There's obviously a lot of conversation around films, be it Minari, be it, Nomadland, which was directed by Chloe Zhao. A lot of stories like those. There's also films like Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, or Burning by Lee Chang-dong that are actually coming from Asian countries. And to just think of the difference also in form and style and the ways in which Asian American films that gain mainstream success tend to be elegant and staid and have this emphasis again on the personal, on realistic. They tend to be portraits of people, of places. And Actually, if you look at a lot of Asian art, whether, whichever country is from, whether it's in animation or expanded media, or even your, traditional cinema, there's so much more experimentation. The genres tend to be non-realistic, melodramatic, or camp, or action. There's just a space for more, I critique when you're not constantly positioning yourself against whiteness. There's room for class and caste and other kinds of critique. And so I'm curious how you position yourself within that identity when you make work, Are you drawing? Are you thinking about Asian traditions? Are you thinking about American traditions? What sort of lineage do you think about? That's a big question, I know.
Yeah. I'll take it. I'll make an attempt. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge question, and I mean, it kind of is the question, right, for diasporic makers, or one of the big questions is, how do you see your lineage? With what lineage do you see your work being in conversation with? And I think definitely I see those assimilationist kind of pressures of just thinking about looking at the industry and looking at white gatekeepers kind of asking for universal stories that often are, based on some sort of trauma or war or strife or current event, and kind of, character-based, overcoming an obstacle, very traditional, conventional storytelling forms. And I think there's how industry views the market and how white gatekeepers view what is a universal story, right? But at the same time, I think there is also, as Asian Americans, as people who have been othered and sort of dehumanized for so long, I think there is also kind of, I look at a lot of Asian American recent films and it's like, we just want to be seen as human. That is kind of like still so key to, I think, a lot of Asian American storytelling, is that, and not being able to get away from that, like you said, that people making films in a more like Asian market are, like you said, there's kind of more room for experimentation. So yeah, I don't know. I think there is that pressure there. I also think, though, part of kind of getting to a place where there is more freedom is thinking about this larger lineage of Asian American filmmaking. So looking at, my site is lined with visions and these kinds of works where I feel like there have been very formally and creatively experimental works by Asian Americans, but they're usually sort of, they usually don't have a huge platform compared to works by white filmmakers. And also they're often sort of described primarily as Asian American films rather than as creative nonfiction or, hybrid works.
Right.
And I think that is sort of a fractured lineage that makes, where everyone is kind of, often Asian American filmmakers feel like they're still starting from kind of first base, or like starting from like can't think of the right metaphor here. I'm like the beginning line. I don't know anything about sports, but but I think there's I need to look back at the lineage of Asian American filmmaking in kind of more critical ways. Yeah.
I get very angry and like hot and bothered talking about this, so I'm gonna try and be somewhat coherent. I guess I should.
No, coherence is tyrannical. We're all about incoherence.
Yeah, coherence is hegemonic.
Exactly.
Okay then. But I guess I wanted to start out just like people, in particular white men associated with the art world or the film industry, are always telling me, Alison, you should make work about Vietnam. And usually my reply to that is, well, I already am. It's not, I don't have to ever make work explicitly about Vietnam. I'm not like, if you know my work, I'm not gonna like take a camera into the street and shoot at sunset and like get dust kicking off the bicycle. You know, it's just totally, I'm so against that kind of style of approaching a place or people, or even a form. So, I mean, I think like I've always pushed against this kind of ethno kitsch, or this like desire for ethnography from the place of, you know, white people, basically. But I also feel like I'm a kind of rare example. Like from a very young age, I've really hated this. Like being like a small punk kid in New Jersey, like really disliking this. It to like succumb to optics, to like promote your identity as going hand in hand with your artwork, to me feels like it cheapens what you're doing, or it reduces itself, if it is not complicated, you know. And there are many exceptions to this, and there are many extraordinary artists who are specifically working with race or sexuality who do this thoroughly. But I think like the market has produced like so much garbage, you know, and it's like usually for a mass audience. But I mean, what I tell myself when I get very worked up is like, not everything has to be for everybody. I don't make work for everybody. And I think like the more complicated you can make an idea in some ways, especially with regard to ideas we're talking about, the better. Like not everything has to be understood, you know, in a square photo. Like, come on. Not everything has to be understood the minute you walk into an exhibition. And I think that's a bigger kind of issue within how we consume media, images, artwork, you know, the effect of technology and politics on our life. It's not just a binary between white people and people of color.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that there's a way in which the emphasis, or this identitarian or essentialist impulse also can manifest as a sort of color blindness, even though that those seem like opposite sides of the spectrum. So I was thinking of, I think the film is called, it's the David Copperfield film. I'm forgetting the full title, but it's the new David Copperfield film that stars Dev Patel as David Copperfield and this mixed race cast. And it's a really fun movie that I guess is trying to do something revisionist, right? And that's a big trend now. These like revisionist movies and TV shows that often sometimes have these like ahistorical characters of color. And I guess it like bothers me a little bit, not because I don't want to see a brown David Copperfield or a black James Bond or, you know, these kinds of characters. But to me, it's like a film set in that era in the UK having these characters walking around with no reckoning with the sort of like racial or imperial relations they were probably caught in at that time feels like a candy coated vision of diversity, you know, because diversity isn't just like, oh, you know, brown person could be a prince in the 1600s in London. Like, you know, no, that's it. What it means is to like acknowledge the ways in which, first of all, that people who weren't princes were also doing super radical and interesting things that are worth, you know, making stories on, but also that there were very real relations, you know, of power that continue to influence our world today. And so I don't know, there's just this tension. I feel like the ask that, you know, do not see artists and actors of color just for their identity gets interpreted in this wholly, I think, counterintuitive way, right? Where like we don't want we don't want to just be faces that you can cut and paste anywhere either.
Yeah, I think it's really insidious. Like there's an Anne Boleyn movie or TV series with where they cast Jodie Turner-Smith, and then of course Bridgerton is also kind of like colorblind casting, right? And I think, yeah, it's like instead of actually reckoning with our colonial past, imperial past, the very real like power dynamics in our society, we're just going to like put you in the stories that we're already telling ourselves about our society. You know, it's very like, I am all for people getting work. We all need to get work. We all need to get paid. I think it's, you know, it's an interesting experiment, but I do think it's insidious because, like you said, it erases all of these very real dynamics. And I think, yeah, like for me, watching something like that, I'm just like, I don't like, you know, a brown person wouldn't have been in this context, like, you know, so like, I don't know.
I think it's libtarded. I really do. That's all I'm gonna say. It's like, I don't know. I just shake my head. I can like envision all the like terrible conversations that went into planning it. And yeah, it's sad. But yeah, I think
I mean, you're so right, because it is the liberal sorry, there was an audio lag and I thought you were done.
No, I'm just
the
laughing.
digital space. I thought you were glitching. I've forgotten that you're Alison, you know.
Oh, okay. It happens.
Sorry. I was just saying, you're so right. It is a kind of fantasy. You know, that is one kind of fantasy where racism doesn't exist or didn't exist. And the other kind of fantasy is the one, you know, the one we've been talking about, the one with kind of, you know, with Andra 8, which is where these things do exist, but you've sort of demonstrated, you've almost like pointed to things that exist in a starker way by reimagining them in a slightly futuristic space. I mean, the most interesting thing about Andra 8 is nothing is actually that futuristic. I mean, you said that
yeah.
Right.
I did this also before the pandemic. That's when I started this. And then all of a sudden, you know, March came around, which is really when John and I were getting into the like nitty gritty part of the animation and motion capture. And then all of a sudden, like what I was making work about like became a reality. People like being constantly surveilled at home, working, you know, in their pajamas or like, you know, whatever, answering these abstract calls, you know, talking to like JPEGs or, you know, pixels, H.264s. Yeah, it was interesting, but I wanted it to be very deliberately close to reality. I mean, uncanny valley, etc., etc. But I think with CG, it's so easy to just lose your shit to like, you know, have fucking alligators like coming through the window and to have like humongous everything and like that's cool, and I definitely did that a bit towards the end. But I kind of wanted to be restrained in the beginning so that it had more meaning.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't feel that futuristic in the sense that, you know, obviously like real virtual assistants, but then also, you know, just like we are all doing that labor of content creation and, you know, sort of performing emotional labor online and having our personal brands or whatever. So I think what's great about Andra 8, among many other things, is that it makes that work really visible. And I think,
No, I was just saying thanks for noticing that, because I really wanted to make it physical, like,
yeah,
you know, these invisible processes.
Yeah, and I think,
and a lot of the.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Sue.
I was just gonna say.
Sorry, I think there's a bit of a lag. So yeah,
it's fine. We're all living in glitch worlds, and I love it. No, I think just thinking about Asian futurism as like, you know, something that's clearly very fraught. You know, thinking about techno-Orientalism and, you know, Asians as robots, but also, you know, thinking about things that we're excited about within Asian futurism. I think there is this real, there's this thread that I've been seeing with a lot of artists that I really admire, bring sort of, you know, feminist aspect to thinking about this topic of emotional labor, of an ethics and aesthetics of care. and sort of kind of a collective care within this space of technology. And I think, I think they're just really exploring a lot of interesting questions and drawing them to the forefront of like what role this technology is playing in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, what is really cool about Andra 8 and, that sort of futurism that does not feel so futuristic is a lot of the things that in our everyday lives we think of as from the future or, sort of technological marvels do have unseen, people behind them. And I was just thinking, people, even though people know this, I don't know if people spend time thinking about the fact that when they do same day delivery on Amazon, or when they can press a button to have something brought to them at their doorstep, there is a person. We haven't gotten to teleportation yet. So a lot of these things that feel very like immediate and instant and, these scientific achievements still have the very same kinds of labor relations that existed before. And it's just that for some people they are invisible and so they feel magical, and others actually still have to live them in a very embodied way. And it got me thinking, like, Sue, you brought up Asian futurism, and I was thinking, of course, in relation to Afrofuturism, which takes many forms, but one particular direction it often takes is imagining a world where either colonialism has not taken place, or if not pre-imperialist, but a world that imagining what the African world might look like if those historical interventions had not taken place, or imagining the unity of tradition and modernity of pre and post-colonial artifacts like coming together in some productive way. And I'm curious what you think an Asian version of that would look like. I feel like it's a very complicated question because the word Asian is so broad, and again, the historical circumstances of various Asian countries are so specific. But just from your vantage point, what is like some direction like that, which feels both positivist, not techno-Orientalist, but a way in which I guess we can create visions that open up alternate ways of being for us as a community. Okay.
That was complicated.
I'm like repeatedly doing this thing where I'm like, so what do you think the future should look like? Give me a diagram.
It's like so heavy. I'm trying to.
But I mean, I also have to say, like, I thought about this question all day, and I was like, I should go in with one answer, But it's really. Sorry.
I said, I want to hear what you have to say.
No, I shouldn't have suggested that. I was going to say that, like,
people in the chat, save us. Tell us what the Asian future should be.
Or what Asian futurism? I mean, how can we like make something that feels like it's cognizant of the ways in which technology and global flows of capitalism affect our lives, and be aware of that and imagine futures in which we're not necessarily ignoring that had happened, or imagining a world where that hasn't happened, but a world in which we're able to turn that into something subversive and productive. I mean, a film that comes to mind that isn't Asian futurist, but is, I guess, Latin American futurism, is Alex Rivera's Sleep Dealer, which I don't know if you guys have seen, and that's a really interesting take on the gig economy and outsourcing and how it is extractive of certain communities while providing these magical benefits to other communities, and how that like foments a kind of rebellion. And of course there's examples of Arab futurism there's really interesting stuff happening there, like people like Larissa Sansour, you know, she has this great film called Nation Estate, which imagines a vertical solution for Palestine, where Palestine is like a single skyscraper.
That's amazing.
It's amazing. It's really amazing. And she kind of goes through, there's a character who goes through an elevator, and each floor is like a different city or, you know, different historic part of Palestine. And that just got me thinking. I mean, I don't even know what an Indian futurism necessarily looks like. I think the question is also like very challenging in the Asian context, because as we were discussing, Asia is already viewed as the future, right? Like, I think, you know, there's that famous Baudrillard essay where he described Japan as a satellite of the earth. You know, there's already the ways in which consumerism and the ways in which like technology meets either like resource starvation or these like other realities in these countries is already viewed as like somewhere in the future. And maybe that's why it's so hard to think of what a revisionist Asian future looks like.
Yeah, I think those sorts of images of Asia just take up a lot of kind of like psychological space. And so it's hard to get around them. But I also think, I mean, firstly, I think an Asian futurism to me is like necessarily heterogeneous because of, like you said, this like huge community that we're talking about, but also because I think there's this instinct of, you know, I guess we see the kind of like dystopian cities that are sort of like Asian inflected, right? Like the Blade Runner model. But then there's also this idea of like the self-contained future, right? Everything is clean and mechanical. And I think some interesting directions that I have seen in the sort of expanded media space are looking at spiritualism and technology, or nature and technology, right? Like we had this really cool project at LA Asian last year that was reconstructing native plants around Los Angeles in augmented reality. So those are interesting directions, I think. And then also I kind of feel like, and I think Andra 8 is like a great example of this, or kind of falls within this kind of direction, is just since Asians have been racialized as robots, and you know that has been used over, you know, centuries to kind of, or you know, decades, whatever, to kind of subjugate them or justify that subjugation. I think we can like lean into the robotness of it. You know, I think now we're having more interesting conversations about what is a robot, what is human, how are we defining the boundaries of what is human, what is a cyborg, you know, and kind of what the shifting kind of spaces of all of those definitions are. And so I think we can lean into it and really dive into that, because those are conversations that are kind of just more interesting at this point, you know?
Going back to your question, Devika, when I was creating Andre, I'm not at all an expert whatsoever on Afrofuturism, but I was thinking a bit about Sun Ra, the ending, where his whole thing was like, you know, I'm opting out, like I'm not actually made of this earth. And I think like
the other side of time is kind of,
and I think with the Under 8 work, she opts out. You know, she does not want to be a human. She finds humans to be disgusting. I think like I wanted to push against this sci-fi trope of like the attractive female cyborg who falls in love with like some like hot detective, and then like, oh my god, like she wants to be a human. Like I really wanted to flip that because it's so banal, you know, it's so like
totally
obviously written by like a stupid man, you know. Sorry, but yeah, I wanted her to like just say the system is not, you know, for me, and like, you know, she walks away and you don't really know where she's going, but that's fine. So I think like having a point of refusal and creating an alternative world way outside of
Yeah, I think opt out is a great succinct like motto for it, maybe, because
yeah.
you know, I mean, a lot of the ways in which inequities, whether it's whether, I mean, racial capitalism works is by making us feel like this is just how the system is. It's inevitable. You know, you got to brand your identity. You got to brand your Asianness. Otherwise, you're not gonna, you know, make it. You know, you have to like swallow your principles and do things that you didn't want to do in order to like get by. And so what you're saying, even though obviously Andre 8 takes place in a different context, but just this idea of opting out, I mean, maybe there is a different way of being where maybe there is a way of just saying no. Yeah, and
yeah.
Yeah, and that sounds like a good place to start thinking about the future, just something different, you know, where there's like more than two bad choices. I know we've like gone over time, and Abby has helpfully given me a time cue, but if it's okay with you all, I'll just like to read a couple comments in the chat. I've just had some difficulty keeping up with it, and I do want to make sure that we address a couple questions. So there's a question by David Chan, who is kind of building off of what Alison you just said. Why not flood the content market with enough bootleg white people coded as mixed race Asian American, infinite iterative regressive variations of self-exploitative white perceptions of pan to specific to contorted Asian indigenous culture representation? Until the IP legal market is so overloaded with similar properties that the value of Asian American cultural representative products declines rapidly. Then in the shambles of the resulted bubble burst, we can release self-created collective Asian American works that joyously explore experimental forms for a few years before getting shut down and erased again by the forever regenerative Ouroboros of whiteness. I think this is Asian futurism. I think someone just David, you just answered the question.
It.
Like, yep.
Okay, we can go home. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, this is really like great and funny, but it also does point to, you know, there is a collective aspect to all of this, right? I mean, there is an aspect of organizing that that stuff like the stuff that you guys are making can point us toward these openings, you know, these alternative futures, but to actually move the needle towards them, it has to be more than, you know, a couple people in Brooklyn, you know, outsourcing like their digital avatars. I mean, refusal is only useful if it's done on a scale that attracts attention, or, you know, that actually withholds something of value.
I mean, I think it's important to start doing that individually, though, you know, within your own.
Of course, yeah.
Whew.
Okay. Mustafa Roni Zina is asking, what does using a broad hegemonic term like Asian American that comes out of a white supremacist imagination do to our own framing of our media making, and therefore the way we imagine its future?
Wow, speaking of big questions, there's an easy
Thank you,
one.
Mustafa. I'm not the only one with the big questions today. But it's an interesting question, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes to also back to kind of what we were talking about earlier with how we're framing our work, because I do think, you know, describing all of these films as Asian American films has a flattening effect and often does limit the potential that they have for distribution, right? If people are thinking about them as Asian American films for an Asian American market, or, you know, Asian American films for the month of May. But I think at the same time, then there's the political aspect of it, of solidarity, of collective refusal, right? If that is happening. But of feeling the need to label our films as Asian American films so that we can push for equity, so that we can push for greater visibility as a collective. But then, you know, there's pros and cons.
I think just in my own work, only up until recently have I ever been agreed to be in exhibitions or screenings which are categorized or labeled as Asian American, whether it's in a more forthcoming way or if it's in a more like kind of like subtitled way. And in part, I mean, I think before that, like for the majority of like, you know, my late 20s, early 30s, I really wanted to push against that feeling like, you know, imputing race or gender onto my work was like, you know, problematic in all the ways that we've discussed. But I began to kind of change my mind when I started watching more Asian American work, and like wanting to really push against the like the impulses that I was seeing in the work, you know, to cater to a white audience, to create a narrative which is easily programmable, easily sellable, easily streamable. And I don't think my work explicitly addresses issues that have to do specifically with being Vietnamese American. Like I would never show war spectacle in any of my work. It's just not something I feel like is interesting right now on an ideological level. But I want to be in this context as like a point of like refusal, you know, and to be in that canon, you know.
Totally.
Not like
yeah. I mean, this is something I think about a lot because I didn't grow up in America, so I'm like, I don't know, I don't know if I'm Asian American yet, you know, and something that always I think there is utility to the term in terms of solidarity. It also does refer to an experience that is distinct from, you know, growing up in Asia, an experience of displacement and diaspora. But it also sometimes does seem to, like I was saying earlier, center, you know, American exceptionalism in a way that maybe works against global solidarities. For instance, it always annoys me so much. I think when Sandra Oh moderated an awards show, it was the Golden Globes or something. I remember there was a headline that she is the first Asian woman to host an awards show. I know what they meant, but I was like, you do know there are award shows in Asia and that Asian women host those award shows. You know, I mean, there is just like, the world is a bigger place. You know, It is cool that a Korean film won the Oscar, Best Picture Oscar, but there are like tons of Korean films that win tons of awards that you just don't know about. And so I feel like there's always that tension where that assimilationist impulse is always embedded in there. So it's, you know, how do we recognize that it is a specific reality to be Asian and grow up here, but also not let that get in the way of building those, like a broader worldview.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question from Peter Kim, who is great. Hi, Peter. When we talk about censorship with respect to film, a number of bad countries come to mind, like Iran, China. But as we have suggested, liberal ideologies around colorblindness and identity reductionism feel even more dystopic. Seriously, does the Asian American filmmaker have any easier time operating outside of a coercive hegemony than a filmmaker in China?
Oh, wow.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there's so many levels at which to talk about this, but it's also, I mean, with the globalization of media, you know, Chinese censorship affects us in the US, you know, like just look at the Disney productions recently, right? Like in some ways, with globalized media comes globalized censorship, right? And also looking at, you know, the kind of work that's being commissioned with an eye to a global market. as well is its own form of censorship. So I don't know, kind of sucks for everyone.
I think like within all of this conversation, I think like the thing I am terrified of in general is when artists begin to censor themselves.
Yes.
I think that is like the very insidious effect of, dare I say, neoliberalism and capitalism on the psyche. You know, people unknowingly, you know, discarding their ideas or their feelings and making work to conform to something. I don't know. I think it's very dark.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can make equivalencies, but I think it's important to recognize that censorship can be financial, you know, censorship.
Totally.
Just restrictions on the work, people making the work they want to make can take a lot of different forms. And I have to say one really important thing is the lack of state funding in the US, or how difficult it is to get, you know, state support for artists. And so there are countries that may be more punitive and restrictive in what their filmmakers can make, but that also offer a lot more support. And so I just think that there are different ways in which filmmakers in different parts of the world, you know, there are different kinds of restrictions they're working against. And so I don't know if I would make that equivalence, but I do think that it's good to remember that censorship is not just like bad, you know, a bad government being like, you can't say this, right?
Right. And like, I think that's such an important point. It's like, where does censorship fall and where does like universal healthcare fall on the scope of like, what is preventing me from making the work that I would like to make?
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or, you know, immigration policies.
I mean, I don't think you can divorce any of the racial issues we're talking about from like a very serious economic issue. That's not just in the US, but, you know, within Asia and Europe.
Yeah. There's another question that Abby Chen. The burden of authenticity has long plagued Asian American visual arts as well. The need or expectation to prove one's own humanity under the hegemonic gaze through historical and social tropes. It is also a way to ontologically fence cultural production. Asian Americans are rarely afforded the freedom of speculative ways of beings and futures. I guess it's more of a comment, but that's pretty fascinating too. I mean, the idea that it's a way to ontologically fence cultural production. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I mean, a lot of thoughts. I think I think it's a really great point. And I think like, yeah, like a lot of museums and institutions, they love authentic ethnographic works, you know, in the same way people love collecting like tokens when they go to like different countries for tourism. Sorry, I'm being really cynical. But yeah, I think like in general that work gets more attention and support, you know, particularly because of those aspects. But I think
right.
particularly now more than ever. No, I'm just kidding. Like the notion of authenticity has been really just kind of like thrown up in the air. And in my mind, that's a great thing. You know, what was it to begin with, actually?
Yeah, because I think that's the direction, you know, when we're talking about Asian futurism, that is a direction that I would like to see us continuing in, because I think for sure authenticity is just so fraught, because usually who is deciding what is authentic is white gatekeepers, and what they're deciding is authentic is, you know, stories of Asian trauma, of people of color trauma packaged in like a very specific way, right? Following Western storytelling conventions and sort of prioritizing the individual, all of that, you know. So I think throwing authenticity.
I think it also, Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking of Howie's comment that Asian Americans are rarely afforded the freedom of speculative ways of being in futures. I think it's because it challenges something that as the diaspora, we always need to have and present, which is an origin story, right? I mean, we always talk about the question, where are you from, as this microaggression, but the underlying thing is that we need to have the journey of how we got here. We need to have this origin story of how we came from this, faraway place and found our place here. And so I think that is something that we have to market and sell in a way. And so, yeah, presenting yourself as, someone more speculative or creating like a different narrative for yourself, it feels threatening in some ways to that a lot of nations operate.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole idea of Asian futurism and techno-Orientalism comes from a place of, white Western institutions and people being threatened by the very idea of an Asian future. So I do think there's something threatening there.
All right. Well, we are going to hit 8:30, so I feel like I've dragged this way longer than I should have, but I couldn't help it. I mean, the questions are big. We can keep going, and Sue and Alison are wonderful, and the people in the chat are great. And so, man, this has to just be at a virtual bar next time, Abby and Keisha. With
Oh, a real bar, a real bar.
So thank you to everybody who's tuned in, people who joined in midway through. The entire recording will be on the Sentient YouTube channel. Also, I'm about to paste into chat, if I can do this while talking. Wait, Keisha, can you do the outro and the thank you while I do this?
No, wait.
Abby, you need an Andra 8. You need an Abby 8.
Yes, she
to
does.
do.
She does. I think, what am I supposed to say? Thank you and good night. Thank you and good night.
Yes, there we go. We've got, I just copied and pasted. So again, we have a large team, not a large team, a small team behind us supporting us. I don't know why I said large. It's like 4 people.
It feels large though, but yeah, no.
Behind us supporting all of our activities, as well as, people who have supported us over the past year. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. For more activities about what we're doing, not only through Line of Sight, but through the broader Sentient Art Film apparatus, there's a lot of things that are happening. Sign up for the Sentient Art Film Bulletin. Our dear friend Matt Turner is the editor of the bulletin and produces original content. We promise it is like 80% content and 20% marketing for our own activities. And it's only once a month.
Yeah, once a month. Yes. But also, if there's anything you want to see or hear or talk about, just let us know. It's very loose, and we really just kind of want to keep engaging these conversations. So this is our last panel for now, but hopefully not forever.
Yes, yeah. We're working on more in the future. Thank you all again, and thank you to Devika, Sue, Alison, and we will see you all later.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.